Good evening. I'm Risa Palm, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Oregon. I am proud that our institution has hosted this conference and delighted that you have joined us in addressing the essential issues of ethics after the Holocaust. I would like to share with you a brief parable from the opening pages of Elie Wiesel's book, The Gates of the Forest. When the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go to a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Magib of Mezrich, had the occasion for the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, "Master of the universe, listen. I do not know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer." And again the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sassov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, "I do not know how to light the fire, I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient." It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. Then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Rizin to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. "I'm unable to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and this must be sufficient." And it was sufficient. God made man because he loves stories. Understandably, the most compelling human catastrophe of modern history, the Holocaust, remains before us illuminated by the depth and breadth of its tragedy and by the strength of those who tell its story. In recent years, the academic world has acknowledged the importance of bringing the intense cultural, political, and psychological issues of the Holocaust to the halls of higher education. We at the University of Oregon are honored to participate in doing so, and in concert with such internationally known and preeminent cohort of scholars. At the University of Oregon, we hope to assist our society in always remembering the 6 million Jews and millions of others who died in the Holocaust, people who feared not so much their own deaths, but that they would be forgotten. We strive also to show our students that the events of the Holocaust occurred in the real world, one inhabited by people not so different from us today. We do so with a fervent belief that we will not let it happen again. Our keynote speaker tonight is Deborah Lipstadt. The title of her address is Imaging the End, American Jewry and the Memory of the Holocaust, 1945 to 1995. To tell us something of the format of tonight's event, I wish to introduce to you the Assistant Director of the University of Oregon Humanities Center, which is one of the primary sponsors of this conference. Holly Campbell earned her JD from the University of Oregon School of Law and has been central in coordinating the activities of the Humanities Center, bringing to our community a wide range of outstanding scholars. It is my privilege to introduce to you Holly Campbell.
Thank you, Dean Palm. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad you're here to share this special evening with us. First, a minor housekeeping detail. If our ballroom audience would like to ask Professor Lipstadt a question, we have provided you with an index card on your seat and would like you to fill out a question and pass it to an aisle where a volunteer will bring me a selection of questions. And we will go through them as time permits. I am forever indebted to Professor Martha Minow of Harvard for this quote from Rabbi Hillel. "If I am not for myself, who will be? If I am not for others, what am I? If not now, when?" I interpret these words as exhorting us to embrace the dance of being, to live in the world in a fully participatory and ethical way. By developing the self to its highest good and highest capacity for compassion and empathy, and in turn, inspiring and helping others. I would like to introduce you to someone in our community who lives immersed in the dance and who shows us how and invites us to join in. Sharon Ungerleider is the current board president of Hillel at the University of Oregon, as well as a Wexner Fellow. After receiving her master's in art from Oregon, she helped to develop the Eugene arts community for many years. Her contributions included teaching ceramics on campus, much activity in our Museum of Art, and in serving on the Eugene Arts Commission Citizens Advisory Committee. In the last 10 years, Sharon has turned her energy to nurturing the health and well-being of our local Hillel. Please welcome Sharon Ungerleider.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Deborah Lipstadt. Dr. Lipstadt did her undergraduate training at City College of New York in political science and history. She completed her master's and doctoral degrees at Brandeis University in modern Jewish history. Professor Lipstadt has served on the faculties of UCLA, Occidental College, and the University of Washington. In 1994, she became the DeRote Professor of Modern Jewish and Holocaust Studies at Emory University. Her writings include two critical bestsellers, Beyond Belief, The American Press, and the Coming of the Holocaust, and Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. The latter has been translated into several languages and received the 1994 National Jewish Book Honor Award. Additionally, Denying the Holocaust, published in 1993, was the subject of front-page reviews in the New York Times, the New York Times Book Review, and the Washington Post. Professor Lipstadt has been a consultant to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where she assisted in several aspects of its education and design. In 1994, she was appointed by President Clinton to serve on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council, where she presently chairs the museum's Education Committee. In addition to extensive international lecture tours, Dr. Lipstadt recently accompanied President and Mrs. Clinton to Poland. Professor Lipstadt is frequently called upon by the media to analyze matters of contemporary and Jewish interest. Often these media requests include a rebuttal to denial theory and writings that attempt to promote a Holocaust denial literature. Tonight, we are honored to have Deborah Lipstadt here in Eugene, Oregon at our symposium. On a personal note, it is a delight to have Deborah back on the West Coast for a few days to share with us exciting new thought on the topic of her current research, how the Holocaust has emerged as a cultural, political, social, and religious symbol in America. I am pleased to introduce to you my dear friend, Professor Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you. It is an honor to be part of this program, to be part of this conference. It is quite a massive and impressive undertaking, and I am quite delighted and honored to be one of the speakers chosen to address you. I am particularly honored to be on a program with so many eminent scholars, and I'd like to cite just two of them, both of whom are here with us this evening, particularly Professors Emil Fackenheim and Raoul Hilberg, both of whom have played seminal roles in shaping our understanding of the historical and philosophical implications of this period. All of us, quote-unquote, younger scholars are and will forever be indebted to them for their work. They have literally helped shape the field. So I think those of you who will have an opportunity to hear them later in the conference will recognize why this is so if you're not already well familiar with their work. In his essay, Israel, the Ever-Dying People, Shimon Ravidovich argued that while the world may have many images of the people Israel, Israel has but one image of itself, that of being constantly on the verge of ceasing to be, of disappearing. This threat of doom, of an end which forecloses any new beginning, has hung over Israel since the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Each generation in the diaspora period considered itself the final link in Israel's chain. According to Ravidovich, the fear of destruction, which was so pervasive that it was given expression in the most extreme form, was a valuable asset. It enabled the people Israel to face and surmount disaster. When speaking of the end, hyperbole was the norm. This was evident at the end of the tractate Sota of the Talmud, where the last of the Tanaim, the group of scholars which was responsible for the redaction of the Mishnah, gave voice to this fear. Quote, "When Rabbi Meir died, there were no more makers of parables. When Rabbi Asi died, there were no more diligent students. When Rabbi Zoma died, there were no more expounders. When Rabbi Joshua died, goodness departed from the world." The death of each rabbi of that generation brought an end to good deeds, saintliness, splendor of wisdom, glory of the law, humility, and shunning of sin. This sense of hopelessness, of being the last, was not unique to this generation of rabbis. Many centuries later, Rambam, Maimonides, wrote to the scholars of Lunel in southern France, "This I have to tell you, that in our difficult times there are none left in Israel who care for the Torah and Talmud except for you and your neighbors. All other places are either dead or dying. Thus all that is left to us is you in southern France. Be strong and fortify yourselves for the benefit of our people, for the matter depends on you. That is, the survival of Israel and Torah depends on you alone." Each generation was beset by the fear that subsequent generations would never know Torah and labor on its behalf in the way contemporary generations had. Students gathered at the bedside of the great scholars who had been their teachers and wept because they knew they could never dream of aspiring to their master's greatness, and their students did the same on down through the generations. But it was not only those who studied Torah in its most traditional forms who feared that they would be the last. The leading literary figures of the Haskalah, the Eastern European Jewish Enlightenment, shared this nightmare. Yud Lamed Gordon, the poet laureate of the Enlightenment in Eastern Europe, wondered, "For whom do I labor? Who will tell me the future, will tell me that I am not the last poet of Zion, of Zion, and you my last readers?" Chaim Nachman Bialik's lament was encompassed in his vision of himself as the last of the last. Yosef Chaim Brenner, in Me'ever Legvulim, described Hebrew literature as the pouring out of the soul of the last Jews, the disappearance of the last Jews who will be unknown to succeeding generations. The fears expressed emanated from the conviction that learning, whether it was of Hebrew literature or Talmud, would soon cease, that the quality of study, which had sustained Jews and Judaism for centuries, was on the verge of demise. Without it, these scholars, poets, writers wondered, how could Jews survive? And more importantly, if they did survive, could they survive as Jews? Although they were not oblivious to the dangers from without, the threat they most feared was that whose source was from within. They could do little to control the animus of the non-Jews. They could do much, they hoped, to direct the passion of Jews. According to Ravidovich, this fear of the end became a protective mechanism, which allowed Israel to survive disasters which would have easily destroyed other nations. In anticipating the end, the people Israel became its masters. Thus, no catastrophe could ever take this end-fearing people by surprise, Ravidovich writes, so as to put it off balance, still less to obliterate it, as if Israel's incessant preparation for the end made this very end absolutely impossible. There was yet, however, another source from which a serious threat could and often did come. It was a fear best expressed in Jewish tradition by the Passover Haggadah's observation that in every generation there are those who rise up to wipe us out. B'chol dor omdim aleinu lechalotenu. In this case, the threat was not to the quality of Jewish life, but to the physical survival of the Jewish people. Catastrophe and persecution were considered inevitable. There was a legitimate basis for this fear of destruction. It was and is well grounded in the Jewish experience. Even the most cursory knowledge of Jewish history revealed that the Jewish experience in the diaspora was often tenuous at best. Even when a Jewish community enjoyed a lengthy and uninterrupted sojourn in a country, it often harbored the fear that this security was temporal and could easily be destroyed. My paper this evening will examine the manner in which this fear of destruction from without, as exemplified by the Holocaust, has helped shape Jewish identity in America during the past 3 decades. This confrontation with catastrophe has become a mythic element of American Jewish identity and has served both a positive and negative purpose. It has become a stimulus for motivating Jewish identity, but in certain situations, it has been allowed to assume a dominant role, thereby distorting the true nature of Judaism and becoming the prism through which the Jewish worldview is refracted. The prominence of the Holocaust in American Jewish identity is particularly noteworthy, given that throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s, it was barely on the Jewish communal or theological agenda. In contrast to today, there were virtually no courses on this topic and few commemorations of Yom HaShoah. There were almost no books, conferences, speeches, and museums dedicated to the Shoah. I might point out that, as Professor Hilberg notes, and he might speak of this later in the conference, in his recent autobiography, the troubles he had getting his first work published on this very topic. Those commemorations which were held were generally attended only by by survivors. Non-survivors who attended remembered feeling like they were crashing a funeral. Survivors who came to this country in the end of the 1940s and 1950s were often discouraged from discussing their experiences. They were told Americans were not interested. Writing in 1957, Nathan Glazer observed that American Jews did not seem particularly interested or motivated by the 2 major events in recent Jewish history, the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. In a 1961 symposium sponsored by Commentary magazine on Jewishness and younger intellectuals, only 2 of 31 participants cited the Holocaust as having had a significant impact on their lives. That same year, in a similar symposium in Judaism magazine, the 21 participants virtually ignored the Holocaust. There are a variety of explanations for this phenomenon. From the end of the war and until the early 1960s, post-World War II America was optimistic and focused on the future. Those who had returned from the war were concerned with building a family and a career, not with dwelling on the horrors of the past. Soldiers who liberated camps or who came to camps shortly after liberation and took pictures documenting their experiences came home to discover, to their great dismay, that their friends and families were not interested in those things. But this was not just a function of the home front's distaste for a gruesome topic. Americans were engaged in obtaining material goods and achieving goals that they never had before, and in many cases never dreamt would be theirs, from college educations to home ownership, cars, and televisions. Everything, including babies, was being mass-produced. The post-war boom was in full swing. It was an optimistic time, not a time to focus on a painful past, particularly a past which did not seem to be of direct concern to this country. This event had transpired on another continent. It had been committed by another country against an other people. What relevance did it have for Americans? Moreover, there was a new enemy on the horizon, the communists. There was little desire on the part of this country, particularly in its official circles, to highlight the wrongdoing of our new allies, the Germans. Jews were counseled by government officials to maintain their silence about the Holocaust and Germany's guilt. In a conversation regarding the situation of Jews in the American zone in Germany, General Lucius Clay, who for 4 years, first as deputy commander and later as commander-in-chief, headed the American military government in Germany, told his advisor on Jewish affairs, Professor William Haber, that the anti-Germanism among the Jews in Germany is far more bitter than the anti-Semitism among the Germans. Clay said, well, you folks in the Jewish leadership have got a responsibility. If you ever want to build a base for revived intellectual and emotional and economic health, you have got to forget what happened. But Jews did not need much persuading to keep silent. Until the late 1960s, the ideal of the melting pot still held sway in American popular and political culture. American Jews who fully accepted this notion were intent on stressing how similar they were to the American majority. This manifested itself, at least in part, in a deep determination to blend in with the non-Jewish world. The Lakeville Studies, a study of a Jewish community in suburban Chicago by my own teacher, late Professor Marshall Sclair, demonstrated how critical gaining the respect of the non-Jewish community was for Jews. Surveys revealed that 75% of the Jewish population believed it more important for a Jew to win the respect of their non-Jewish neighbors than to marry within the faith or join a synagogue. As they moved out of urban Jewish neighborhoods into more ethnically and religiously mixed suburban areas, American Jews increasingly adopted the norms of their non-Jewish neighbors. Synagogue membership rose because this was the accepted means of ethnic identification, as opposed to their Zionist and/or political activities of the previous 4 decades. Even the Eichmann trial did not generate any sustained interest in the Holocaust. While the trial was underway, it was widely covered in the American media. Nearly every daily paper in America ran at least one editorial on the trial when it began, and a significant number ran several in close succession, despite the fact that the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion and Soviet space successes were competing for editorial space and attention at the same time. 4 months before the end of the trial, a Gallup poll revealed that 80% of the American public had heard about the trial. That's probably as many as heard about the O.J. Simpson trial. Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which appeared first as articles in the New Yorker and then as a book, generated significant discussion in the Jewish community. Her charge that wherever Jews lived, there were recognized Jewish leaders, and this leadership, almost without exception, cooperated in one way or another, for one reason or another, with the Nazis, provoked great controversy in the Jewish community. Subsequent research on the role of the Jewish councils, the Judenrate, revealed that her conclusions were highly impressionistic and often not rooted in historical fact. But neither the Eichmann trial nor the debate over Hannah Arendt's book resulted in an enhanced interest among American Jews in the Holocaust. An examination of the indices of Jewish magazines and periodicals from the period indicates that there was a momentary flurry of interest in the Holocaust in general, and in Eichmann in particular, but no communal commemorations emerged as a result, no Holocaust memorials were proposed by local communities, and virtually no courses were introduced. The tenor of conversation amongst Jews did not change dramatically. When Commentary magazine conducted another symposium in 1966, on the condition of Jewish belief, the editors did not mention the Holocaust in the 5 lengthy questions they distributed to 38 rabbis and theologians who were participating. Only a small number of the respondents made reference to the Holocaust. The Eichmann trial may have laid the groundwork for what would become an intense interest in the Holocaust, but it was not the decisive event. It may have stimulated some scholars and intellectuals to begin to examine the topic, but it did not result in the placement of the Holocaust on the Jewish communal or religious agenda. In the late 1960s, the situation changed dramatically. Within a decade, there would be such a surge of interest that some Jewish intellectuals and critics, myself included, were bemoaning the potential use and abuse of the Holocaust. The most cursory perusal of any Jewish magazine, newspaper, synagogue bulletin, or educational program attests to this development. Jewish periodicals began to carry numerous articles on the topic. Yom HaShoah commemorations became community-wide events attended by individuals of all ages and backgrounds. Jewish communities throughout the United States began to commit funds for brick-and-mortar commemorations of the Holocaust, many of which were of a rather pedestrian nature. Fundraising appeals, including those which had no overt connection to the Holocaust, used it as a frame of reference. This was not simply a development generated by the natural consequences of time and distance from the event. The Watershed event which stimulated these changes was, of course, the 1967 Six-Day War. In the weeks preceding the war, much of diaspora Jewry believed Israel's destruction was imminent. The silence of the world was reminiscent to them of the world's response to the plight of the Jews in the late 1930s. It seemed to be Evian and 1938 all over again. The United Nations debated while Israel faced potential doom. The late Abraham Joshua Heschel recalled the weeks immediately before the war. In those days, many of us felt that our own lives were in the balance, and not only the lives of those who dwelt in the land, that indeed all of the Bible, all of Jewish history was at stake. The world was silent while 6 million died. The world that was silent while 6 million died was silent again, save for individual friends. The anxiety was grueling. The isolation was dreadful. I had not known how deeply Jewish I was. The outcome was, of course, startlingly different from the Holocaust. Because of the great fears prior to the war, the decisive victory at the end of it evoked even greater emotional and theological responses from American Jews. It could be argued that on a meta-historical level, for Jews, the lightning victories of the Six-Day War constituted the end of the Holocaust. Now it was certain that annihilation would not, or it seemed to be certain that annihilation would not be repeated. Jews would not let their world decide their fate. Masada, where the Zealots made their last futile stand against the Romans in 72 CE, would not fall again. Even though American Jews had not directly participated in the victory, their vicarious involvement, collecting funds in an unprecedented fashion, gave them a sense of being intimately linked to this momentous event. It was a liberating moment for American Jews, and one which touched them deeply. Many Jews, quote, came out of the woodwork, close quote, to celebrate their victory and their Jewish identity. In the wake of such an astounding triumph in the present, it became easier to talk about astounding defeats that had occurred in the past, such as the Holocaust. Interest in Israel also increased exponentially. The number of American students studying Israel at the universities and other programs more than quadrupled within a year after the end of the war. The number of American Jews who visited Israel and organized United Jewish Appeal leadership missions went from 140 in 1964 to 2,000 in 1968. On these trips, which had the aura of a pilgrimage about them, the theme of Israel as an antidote to the Holocaust, Jews would never again wander the earth with no place to go, was given particular emphasis. Israel was not only a bulwark against future Holocausts, but a symbolic counterpoint to the Holocaust. As a result of the war, Jews felt both stronger and more vulnerable. In 1967, the Jewish response to the threats of destruction had been different, and the outcome had been different. The only constant seemed to them to be the world's indifference. The fact that before the war, the UN seemed paralyzed, and after the war, criticism seemed to be heaped on Israel for its victories, only exacerbated this impression amongst many American Jews. For diaspora Jews, the 1973 Yom Kippur War reinforced the notion of Israel's vulnerability. The security offered by the victories of 1967 seemed to evaporate in an instant. Ironically, just as the decisive victories of 1967 put the Holocaust on the communal agenda, the dark moments of the Yom Kippur War had a similar impact. The Shoah seemed to once again loom on the horizon. Ultimately, the military victories which came at the end of the 1973 war fortified the notion of the Jewish emergence from powerlessness, but they did not diminish the renewed sense of vulnerability. But the conflagrations in Israel were not the only stimuli for renewed interest in the study of the Holocaust. there were also changes on the home front, on the American front. At the same time, significant changes were occurring on the domestic American scene. These developments had a profound emotional and social psychological impact on the well-being of the American Jewish community. On all fronts, racial, religious, and political, those that Jews had once considered comrades became at best erstwhile friends. Alliances which had assumed in the past an almost spiritual quality dissolved with amazing rapidity. Anti-Semitism, which American Jews had grown to expect from the political right, now emanated from the liberal left, a place on the political spectrum which they had considered their home. The anti-Semitism of the New Left, the Black Power movement, and the 1968 New York City teacher strike, which pitted Jewish teachers against African American communities, all caused American Jews to experience a sense of dissonance as the last pillar of their trust in the Gentile world was shaken. They felt abandoned by religious leaders with whom they had engaged in interfaith dialogue, who remained silent during the fearful days of May 1967. By the late 1960s, African Americans, whose cause they felt they had adopted as their own, seemed to be targeting Jews as particularly responsible for their own travail. The impact on American Jews of the open expression of anti-Semitism in the African American community cannot be underestimated. It instills and continues to instill in Jews both an intense anger and fear. Anger at what they consider a betrayal by former allies, and fear at the apparent willingness of leading figures both within the African community and outside it to rationalize or explain away this phenomenon. Most recently, the call to separate the message from the messenger, which emerged around the Reverend Louis Farrakhan's Million Man March, evoked in Jews resonances of the rise of National Socialism in Germany. I heard a number of American Jews, quote unquote, recall that Hitler's anti-Semitism was, at the outset of the 1930s, often dismissed as nothing but a tactic designed to unite his followers. Observers here and in Germany in the 30s separated Hitler's Jew hatred from his seemingly positive ideas for restructuring the ailing German economy. At the time of the Million Man March this past fall, I heard many a number of American Jews, make similar analogies. Many American Jews had long considered the causes of the liberal left as synonymous with Judaism and its tenets. By the mid-1970s, many of these same Jews increasingly saw Israel and Israelis, whom they considered vicarious extensions of themselves, portrayed by the left as the oppressors. Even the United Nations, which American Jews once considered a locus of international justice, became the place for vicious assaults on Israel's representatives. These assaults were often laced with overt anti-Semitism. The nadir of this tendency was reached in 1975 with the passage of the Zionism is Racism resolution. Jews, including those who had stressed universality during the 1950s and 60s, felt caught up by forces which they could neither control nor which they could fully understand. The conviction that anti-Semitism posed a potential danger for American Jews was not limited to a particular age group, nor was it only for those from a specific end of the political or religious spectrum who expressed fears that the non-Jewish world still posed a threat to the Jews. In 1970, a poll of Reform synagogues in America found that 87% of those queried disagreed with the statement that anti-Semitism will never be a major problem for American Jews. Studies of anti-Semitic attitudes in America revealed that the only negative perception of Jews which had risen since the end of World War II was that they possess, quote, too much power, close quote. Jews are uncomfortable, or at the best, ambivalent about the charge that they possess great power. Once again, the Holocaust served as a convenient historic symbol to answer these charges. It demonstrated to American Jews the consequences of powerlessness, Jews during the Holocaust having been powerless, and illustrated why a group which supposedly had made it in America felt so vulnerable. It legitimized Jews' resolve not to be powerlessness. The situation of the Jews in Germany in the 1930s became a leitmotif to convince American Jews that they were not being, quote, paranoid, close quote. German Jews had felt similarly, completely secure in Germany and completely German. Nonetheless, American Jews were often reminded by leaders of the American Jewish community and hastened to remind others German Jews were ultimately rendered completely powerless. The Holocaust became both an example and a justification of the need for power. For those disillusioned with old allies and still somewhat uncomfortable with their new priorities, the Holocaust as a symbol justified a change in Jewish political behavior. Jews felt increasingly willing to openly advocate support of candidates and causes who were seen as sympathetic to Jewish causes. Jewish political action committees began to grow and multiply in number. Never before had American Jews been comfortable to openly ask, is this person, policy, or legislative bill good for the Jews, and not just, is it good for everyone else? There was another reason for this surge of interest in the Holocaust. Those who first began to call for courses on the Holocaust and remembrances of the Holocaust were the baby boomers, members of the generation born in the wake of World War II. They were anxious to know what had happened during the war and had no compunctions about asking, what did America do and what did American Jews, their parents' generations, do and not do? They felt no sense of guilt for having remained silent. They used the Holocaust as a convenient symbol to differentiate between their public Jewish behaviors and those of their parents. In doing so, of course, they were emulating other Americans of their own age who were engaged at this time in the 70s in a frontal assault on everyone and everything over 30. One shudders to think about that. They were among those who began to push for a more aggressive Jewish agenda for the American Jewish community. None of this would have happened had there not been fundamental changes in the tenor of American life. During the 1970s, America began to experience what has been called the roots phenomenon. Ethnicity was in. Jewish baby boomers were on campus as ethnic studies blossomed. As a result of America's enchantment with ethnicity, they felt freer to assert their minority status. They, along with other American Jews, now began to feel that their Jewish identity was not something to camouflage, but something to celebrate. For them, Judaism became an option, not a burden. They saw themselves as free to choose whether or not to be Jewish. In contradistinction to the Jewish communities of the 1950s and early 60s, they argued that their Jewish identity was relevant and was distinctive. They were unlike their parents who had wished to be accepted as an equal in society, not because they were Jews, but because their Judaism was irrelevant. Though this generation of baby boomers wanted to choose to be Jewish, many did not have the tools or education to draw on a wealth of Jewish tradition. They did not, however, need any education or background to understand the message, Esav perennially hates Jacob, i.e., anti-Semitism is a constant. A visceral reaction to persecution and prejudice are the lowest common denominators in ethnic identity. The Holocaust served as a graphic demonstration of what Jews had to avoid. The problem was, it did not teach them what Jews should embrace. It was during this period that children of Holocaust survivors also reached an age when they began to discuss their parents' experiences and their own unique heritage as children of survivors. Some, though certainly not all, of those who began to study the event and call for its commemoration were children of survivors. Of equal, if not greater significance, was the feeling among survivors themselves that they no longer had to repress their stories. In the immediate aftermath of the Shoah, survivors believed, and in certain cases were explicitly told, as I mentioned earlier, often by survivors who had preceded them to America, that Americans were not interested in their experiences and that it was better for them to remain silent. Many of the survivors had, by the time of the 70s, come to feel more secure and at home in America. As Holocaust courses and memorials proliferated, survivors who had never spoken about their experience were asked to come forward to relate their story. They were pleased and surprised that people were interested in what they had to say. Oral history testimonies began to be collected. Those who in the 1950s had been thought of as refugees were now survivors and were treated with great reverence by the Jewish community. For survivors, this was an empowering moment, making them feel that they had a newfound status in the community. They became one of the driving forces behind the proliferation of Holocaust museums and memorials. If the Six-Day War was a watershed in the realm of foreign affairs, NBC's The Holocaust, a 9.5-hour miniseries, was of equal significance in the realm of popular culture. It stimulated and validated an already existing trend. The audience was estimated to be over 120 million people. Some criticized it for trivializing the Holocaust and mixing advertisements for pantyhose with scenes at Auschwitz. Others argued that despite its vast historical and creative shortcomings, and they were legion, it set the stage for a new look and acceptance of the subject of the final solution in the public consciousness. In the best tradition of American popular culture, NBC's Holocaust offered knowledge to hundreds of millions of people who otherwise would have remained ignorant. The success of the show, newspapers, schools, and universities were full of discussion of it, conveyed a message to many American Jews. If NBC thought it important enough to devote 9.5 hours, if major advertisers were willing to buy commercial time, and if 120 million Americans tuned in, the Jewish population of the United States is approximately 5.5 million, then it was acceptable to call public attention to this event. The impact of the miniseries extended well beyond the Jewish community. Former President Jimmy Carter, my colleague at Emory, who watched the show, was motivated, at least in part, by it to establish a United States Holocaust Memorial Council. The council was charged with responsibility for creating a memorial to the Holocaust in the nation's capital. After a series of false starts, it eventually oversaw the building of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Mall in Washington. The tremendous growth of interest in the Holocaust, which evolved in the 1970s, brought in its wake a number of disturbing developments. There was a tendency in certain quarters of the Jewish community to skew the course of Jewish history so that the Holocaust in particular and anti-Semitism in general became the cornerstone of the Jewish experience, resulting in what the late Professor Selo Baron called the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. Persecution and suffering became the centerpiece of the Jewish experience. The Holocaust was something used as a means of heightening Jewish identity. It served to deliver the historically inaccurate message that anti-Semitism and persecution were the keystones of Jewish identity, and that because, rather than despite, the ever-present threat of anti-Semitism, Jews must remain Jews. American Jews' interest in the Holocaust was not a manifestation of their own fears that anything might happen to them personally as a result of anti-Semitism. It constituted a valuable instrument for a generation which was exploring its identity in a fashion that was more intensive than the homes in which they were raised. Many of those who were particularly interested in the Holocaust as a model were intensely involved in Jewish communal affairs. They were leaders of the Jewish community. The Holocaust became a reminder to them of what happens when Jews do not come to the aid of other Jews. Often the Holocaust has been and continues to be used in facile ways to demonstrate to American Jews why they should support particular Jewish causes. In the 1970s, a poster calling for Jews to support Israel showed a Chassid praying at the Western Wall. The caption read, 30 years ago, his back was up against a different wall. The cause of Soviet Jewry was also impacted by this newfound grappling with the Holocaust. Throughout the 1960s, efforts to aid Soviet Jews maintain their Jewish identity had been coordinated by the State of Israel. Due to foreign policy considerations, they were conducted in a sub-rosa fashion. In the wake of the Six-Day War, after the USSR broke diplomatic relations with Israel, a few Soviet Jews went public in 1968 with their desire to leave the Soviet Union. American Jewish students were in the vanguard of those who called for public demonstrations in the United States on behalf of Soviet Jews. Much of the rhetoric concerning Soviet Jews contained overt reminders of the Holocaust. The post-Holocaust generation was quick to contrast its response to the cause of Soviet Jewry with its parents' response to Nazi anti-Semitism. One graduate student speaking to a rally of 800 Jewish women in Faneuil Hall in Boston, castigated her parents' generation for remaining silent in the face of the Holocaust. She contrasted it and praised her own generation for refusing to do so, to remain silent when confronted with the travail of Soviet Jews. Much of this rhetoric was, of course, historically inaccurate, but that did not stop the students from making these facile comparisons. But the students were not alone. The Soviet Jewry movement, which by 1972 had been completely adopted by the organized Jewish community, used Holocaust analogies in much of its publicity. Shortly before the Soviet Union, an aid to solicit funds for aiding Soviet Jewry depicted a memorial candle, a yahrzeit candle, with the caption, "A million Soviet Jews don't want to be remembered this way." The ad totally ignored the fact that no one was threatening Soviet Jews with annihilation or anything close to it. In the background of the ad, behind the memorial candle, were the names of all the major death camps. This inappropriate invoking of the Holocaust for political, sociological, and fundraising goals has evoked some very sharp criticism from scholars in the field. In 1981, literary critic Robert Alter feared that the Holocaust had become the major symbolic element in Jewish life as it superseded other aspects of Jewish identity. Rabbi Harold Schulweis criticized the Manichaean metaphysics reflected in the politicization of the Holocaust as the world was divided into them and us. They, the predictable persecutors, we, the inevitable victims. Some expressed misgivings that it had become, in the words of Yafa Elyach, the Holocaust had become an instant Judaizer, shocking people back into their Jewishness. These critics were reacting to commemorations which fell into the category of a push from without, i.e., be Jewish because of anti-Semitism, be Jewish because of the Holocaust. Similarly, when the Holocaust was linked with the State of Israel, the emphasis was on the dangers facing the State of Israel and not on the rebirth of Jewish culture and identity the state represented. One of the reasons that the Holocaust became such a facile tool in the hands of community organizations was that many American Jews had difficulty identifying Jews on the basis of shared knowledge about, identifying as Jews on the basis of shared knowledge about their tradition. They could, however, identify on the basis of a shared destiny, a destiny that entailed the potential of being an ever-preyed-upon people. The problem inherent in this approach was that it skewed Jewish history and tradition and provided no corresponding pull from within, i.e., an association with a positive symbol. Even more importantly, it ceded to Jews' enemies the power to determine the ebb and flow of Jews' identity. The changing agenda, my final section, a hesitant prediction. In the past few years, the myth of annihilation to redemption seems to have lost some of its power as a propelling force for American Jews. In the popular consciousness of American Jews, anti-Semitism is still a significant reality. American Jews still believe that given the right complex of circumstances, it can reassert itself and prove a definite threat. The popularity a number of years ago of Alan Dershowitz's book, Chutzpah, which argued that Jews do not fight for their right, is a reflection of this belief. It is a manifestation of the exhortation, never again. Dershowitz expressed his total dedication to the worthy goal of fighting anti-Semitism. The problem is that a culture and a tradition cannot be transmitted solely on the basis of a fight against something. It must be connected to a struggle on behalf of certain values, principles, and tradition. One could argue that things are changing. For the Jewish leaders who are close to the vortex of organized Jewish life, annihilation no longer seems to be as central a motivating factor as it once was. This development may well be the result of a surfeit of attention during the 70s and 80s, attention which played on emotions, but which rarely educated and analyzed the Holocaust in serious detail. The National Jewish Population Study of a few years ago, which revealed that the intermarriage rate in the United States was 52%, made many American Jews recognize that something was terribly wrong in the way Jewish identity was being transmitted. Jewish communal groups, which once sponsored intensive discussions on the history of the Holocaust, recognized that the Holocaust must not become the rationale for the Jewish experience. It is interesting to note that this has occurred even as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has become one of the premier museums in Washington, consistently attracting, in the 3 years since its opening, twice as many visitors as the most optimistic predictions had anticipated. The impact of the museum on American Jewry, as well as on American popular culture, is yet to be fully determined or understood. It is critically important that my remarks tonight not be interpreted as a criticism of study or commemoration of the Holocaust. It is essential for American Jews, not to mention non-Jews, and maybe even more essential for non-Jews, to comprehend the complete implications of the Holocaust. Moreover, it is essential for them to fully understand what happened and not simply go through an emotional catharsis. That is why the evolution of university-level courses and programs of study on the Holocaust are such an important and significant development. It is equally important that Jewish communal institutions, both lay and religious, not use the Holocaust to foster other causes and accomplish their motives. What must be achieved is a balance between remembering what was done to Jews and living as Jews. Reductionist and obscurantist approaches to history must be avoided. There must be continual recognition of and vigilance against the threat from without, anti-Semitism. But that external threat must never be relied upon as a Jewish raison d'etre. There must be equal, if not greater, recognition of the threat from within, self-destruction. If a concerted effort to fight both these perils prompts the Jewish community to truly educate itself and to wrestle with Jewish tradition and culture in all its manifestations, then in the words of Rabadovich, the ground will have been prepared for the last Jews who will come after us, and for the last Jews who will rise after them, and so on until the end of days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lipstadt. While our assistants are gathering your questions, I'll ask perhaps one or two. I was wondering if you could give us some examples of some proactive Judaic identity you see in younger generations now that are less reactive to negative, memories of the past.
Well, I think, is this on? Is this on? Can you hear? Yes, okay. I think one of the main examples, and since I'm on a university campus, I'll talk about Jewish studies programs on campus, which of course are not and should never be designed to only address the needs of Jewish students. But having taught Jewish studies on major university campuses for 22 years now, you can see that the interest, the channeling of interest in learning about Jewish history, learning about Jewish culture, learning about Jewish tradition in all its manifestations, both from the history of the Holocaust to Jewish philosophy or other aspects of Jewish history, is a very, what you described as a proactive expression of that Jewish identity. It encompasses the Holocaust, but it doesn't use the Holocaust as a means or as a raison d'etre for Jewish identity.
Thank you. Let's see. I was also privileged to catch I guess a re-aired episode of Frontline a couple of weeks ago, during which 3 or 4 Polish American survivors went back to their hometowns or the hometowns of their parents and walked around, and it was a documentary.
Shtetl.
Yeah, right. It was very, very moving, and I was wondering, it was not possible for me to tell if that was a widely done method of personal commemoration or if it was an isolated event.
I think the trips back to hometowns, often with children and then grandchildren. It's not widely done. First of all, there aren't that many people who survived. There are a lot of people who have no desire to go back to those sites because they know how their neighbors treated them. And it's a difficult journey, but I know of quite a few families that have done that. And I also know quite a few children of survivors who go back and try to trace their family's roots. It's a way of coming in contact with a history which has shaped their own identity.
Do you believe the Holocaust should not be taught until a student reaches a certain age, like Jewish mysticism?
Very, very good question. That was some mystic here. In the best of all possible worlds, my answer to that would be yes. That until a student achieves a certain level of understanding that when someone is persecuted, it's not necessarily because they've done something wrong, an understanding of what it means to collaborate, an understanding of what it means, what the nature of anti-Semitism, an understanding of totalitarianism. All these various things, until they can fully understand that, I don't think the Holocaust should be taught. But given the world in which we live, in which there is so much discussion of it in the public airwaves, my niece, who's now 13, about 5 or 6 years ago, or if not more than that, called me up on the phone and said, will you please tell me about the time when they were doing bad things to Jews and Jews threw themselves against the fence to be killed rather than to stay where they were. I think she had seen an advertisement for Escape from Sobibor or something, and it had shown a death camp inmate throwing themselves against an electrified fence or whatever. And she was 6, 7 years old, so it was already in her consciousness, or television ads for Schindler's List, or various and sundry other things. It's very hard to say to her, well, when you're 15, come back and I'll tell you about it. But the truth is, I think in terms, or when you're 16, in terms of really understanding this as a serious, in a serious kind of way, and not a slipshod or way that just makes a shortcut to the emotions, I think older is better. And I certainly think the university is the prime place for doing it.
What has been the effect of the development of the historiography of the Holocaust upon the development of the Holocaust in the public mind, do you think?
Well, I think you can take, without going into the nature of the debate, we're right now in the midst of a debate over a book that just came out by an assistant professor at Harvard, which has entered the public arena in the way that few scholarly debates ever do. Most people didn't know scholars fought like this. We often do, but not in the front pages of the Times or in the German press or in National Public Radio, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there is a much more consciousness of it than we ever would imagine possible. Now, of course, we're talking about in America where 12%, I think, or 13% of the people believe Elvis Presley is alive and well and living someplace. So, people are conscious. USA Today people who read USA Today as their daily newspaper get a lot of news compared to what most Americans get. So when you talk about American consciousness of events in detail and in their shades of gray, you're talking about a limited audience. Nonetheless, I think there is increasing consciousness of it. In terms of, I'm still flabbergasted every time I go to the Holocaust Museum, and it's at least once a month, to watch the lines around the block, especially during, as the winters finally receded, of people coming to see it. The current visitorship is 82% non-Jewish. I mean, just doing the figures, the museum's been open 3 years. It's had 2 million visitors a year. That would, if every Jew would have had to go twice, because you have to eliminate a certain number of children, et cetera. So it's primarily non-Jewish, and it's fascinating to sit and listen to the comments, to stand in the lobby and listen to the comments, to go through the exhibit, and just listen to the comments of people who are visiting and what this evokes in them. And sometimes you see, in a very moving way, people trying to convey lessons to their children. One scene I witnessed a while ago was in the section on the rescuers, the non-Jewish rescuers. And a woman had been going through before me, and I was walking behind, and I could tell from her comments that she was not Jewish, because the way she said, she talked about Jews in the third person plural, they do this, or they, in explaining to her son what they were seeing, especially when there were certain Jewish ritual items and things like that. When they got to the section on the rescuers, she turned to her son and she said, if we had been there, this is what we would have done. Now, setting her moral certitude aside, because as the research on rescuers shows, most didn't know what they would have done until they opened the door and the opportunity to rescue was there before them. You can read the work of Nechama Tech, the Oliners, et cetera. There's a growing body of literature on the rescuers. But it was a way of transmitting, in what I see as a positive kind of way, and one hesitates to even use this term, but quote-unquote the message of the Holocaust, the lesson of the Holocaust. And if it can enter the popular consciousness in this way of a certain responsibility when atrocities occur, then I think that's a positive development.
And that may touch on my next question. How does your talk connect to ethics after the Holocaust? What do we learn about how to respond to the Holocaust when we dwell on anti-Semitism and not on how to escape from such thinking in educating our children?
Well, first of all, I think it's important, it's one way of saying, well, let's talk about race relations in America but not talk about racism. Let's talk about the Holocaust but not focus on anti-Semitism. I mean, that's a ludicrous kind of thing to do. Let's talk about the impact of abuse on children but not talk about abuse itself. You have to focus on what the source of the problem was. And the source of the problem, the source of the Holocaust, was anti-Semitism, along with other factors, but anti-Semitism was the linchpin of this. And not an anti-Semitism which was new, but anti-Semitism that was centuries old. Professor Hilberg shows in the very early pages of his book dramatic ways in which all the legislation of the Nazis was predated by church legislation and other legislation of many centuries before that, and decades and centuries before that. So you have to focus on this. What is the connection to ethics after the Holocaust? Well, I think part of it is for you to make the connection, but to my mind, there are a number of things here. First of all, the role of creating an other, how an other is created, the demands of for action and for ethical, grappling with ethical thought and grappling with the meaning of ethics. It gives us, I guess to put it in short, it's an imperative. It's a stark imperative which demonstrates what happens when there is an absence of both ethical action and an absence of understanding of what ethics truly is in the general population. So that would be the connection that I see.
What does it mean to refer to a person as survivor or victim? Is it dehumanizing and de-individualizing? Does it cause us to regard survivors as something inherently different from ourselves?
Well, I think, first of all, survivors are very anxious to be seen and known as survivors. They went through something, not as their only identity, but they went through something horrendous, and they are anxious for the world to recognize this and to understand that. It's not dehumanizing of them. What was done to them that made them survivors was dehumanizing. I mean, that's the point. And the fact that they can now openly speak of being survivors, where for many years they were thought of as refugees, or they didn't speak of their experience as survivors, is a very important development. So that I think. And the other thing, of course, with survivors is we won't have survivors around for that much longer. In Jewish tradition, I wish everyone and every survivor a full measure of 120 years. But those of you with little children at home, when they're old enough to sit in college, in university classes on the Holocaust, there won't be survivors for people such as myself who teach these courses to bring in to talk about in the first person singular about this is what happened to me, this was my experience. And while often the experience of one individual, you cannot build a history out of that, it's still important that first-person singular experience. It has a certain moral authority, which the voice of history doesn't have. Maybe it should have, but it doesn't have. So I think that recognizing the experience of survivors and talking to them as survivors, about them as survivors, is a recognition of the evil that they experience.
Again, I think you may have anticipated the next question. In my classes, I not only hear false images of the Holocaust, but false images or concepts of Judaism. What can we do as Jewish students to address these problems? Do you think Jewish studies programs play a role in overcoming such problems?
First of all, I think Jewish studies programs are important on campuses for strictly academic, scholarly, intellectual reasons. They should not be thought of as means of raising ethnic identity, ethnic consciousness. The early generations of ethnic studies on campus started in the 70s. Most of them failed because they were ethnic identity or consciousness-raising mechanisms. Jewish studies did not fail because the people involved in it took their profession as scholars and intellectuals exceptionally important and never thought of their classes as for a certain group by a particular group. This is not a closed shop and should never be as no ethnic studies program should be a closed shop. And if it does, then it's failing the university's purposes. If students who attend these classes come out with a heightened sense of identity, that's fine. I mean, as a Jew, and personally, I think there's nothing wrong with that, and I think it's a desideratum. But that's not the agenda with which a professor of Jewish studies should go into a classroom. Now, in terms of one student, the question that said false images of Jews and Judaism, I do think it's important for students who are subjected to, I'm assuming when they say false images of Jews and Judaism, it's a sort of polite way of saying negative or anti-Semitic. I'm assuming that. But when you run into that, I think that then it's very important to challenge those. Just as if a student, white or black, it doesn't matter, ran into expressions of racism in a class, or male or female ran into expressions of sexism in a class, it's important for them to challenge it, not just if they're of the group. If they're of the group, that's irrelevant. Then it's a given. The challenge is for someone not of the group to challenge it. That's when you say we've learned the lesson of what the Holocaust is all about.
If the Six-Day War was so critical an event in American Jews' conception of Israel and their own Jewishness, why didn't the 1948 War of Independence, also a success, have a similar effect?
I think that, first of all, the Jewish world was still traumatized by the end of World War II. The American Jewish community was nowhere near as well organized or in 48 as it was in 67. And America, most importantly, America of 48 and America of 67 were two totally different places. America of 67 was a place that made it comfortable for this expression of identity. America of 48 was an America of growing the coming era of the McCarthy era, the coming era of, you were an American and you celebrated that Americanism and you didn't highlight your differences. It was a very different society in which these two events happened, and I think those are major factors in it. But it did have a major impact, but not as lasting an impact, and it certainly was not seen in the same miraculous way that the Six-Day War. The speed of the Six-Day War, the great fears before, the lightning victories at the end, all those things made a tremendous difference.
Did Israeli society have a parallel period of quiet concerning the Holocaust around 1945 to 1960?
That's a very good question in terms of Israeli society. I haven't looked at it as closely as I've looked at the American scene, but from what I have looked at, yes, there was a period in the 50s, even through almost parallel to America to a certain degree, where the Holocaust was seen. It was certainly discussed. It was Yom HaShoah was instituted by the Knesset in the 50s, but there was a certain shame about the Holocaust in Israeli circles during that period. From all the literature I've read, and the newspaper reports and contemporary journals I've read from the period, and the things that have been written about the period. Certainly, survivors did not speak openly about being survivors during those early years, and children of survivors. This has been documented in studies that have been done. Children of survivors in Israel had a certain shame of what their parents had experienced. The one group of children of survivors did not have that shame, were the children of resistance fighters or partisans, because that fit into the Israeli ethic. You fought back. It was a much more comfortable place to be. And it was only really during the late 60s and 70s, with various hostage-taking incidents, where Israelis became more conscious and historically conscious of the fact of how 2 or 3 people with submachine guns can hold a plane load of people, including many Israelis, hostage, that there began to be a recognition that maybe this event is not so simple. It was just not a matter of fighting back. Initially, when Yom HaShoah it still officially is Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, the Holocaust Memorial and Day of Holocaust Memorial and resistance or heroic efforts. That second part is much more downplayed today, and there's much less of an ambivalence of looking at it strictly as an event of the Shoah.
Why no consideration of the Vietnam War and widespread resistance to the war among the college population, a sizable percentage of which were Jewish?
Passing reference to that, and maybe should have stressed it more, but I think the whole Vietnam protest generation created an aura or an atmosphere where young American Jews felt empowered to protest against their parents' generation. And if you look at that early rhetoric of college students about Soviet Jewry, or college students about the Holocaust, they were silent, we won't be silent. They stood idly by, we won't stand idly by. Silly comparisons, because American Jews of the 40s, America of the 40s was very different than America of the 70s and American Jewry of the 70s, but that didn't stop any of us from making those comparisons. We didn't want to be confused by the facts. But some things never change. But certainly that protest was very important in creating an atmosphere of looking at the Holocaust, and also certain comparisons between what was going on in Vietnam and what was going on in Cambodia. Again, while what was going on was horrible, mistaken and false kind of analogies that were made also facilitated the use of the Holocaust as a symbol.
How do you explain the rise of Orthodox Judaism in America in recent years?
The rabbis ask, Ma'anyan Shemitah Etzel Har Sinai. In the Torah, the giving of the Torah is followed by the law of the sabbatical year. And they say, what's the connection here? I'm not sure what the connection is here in this one. So maybe I'll punt or bunt or whatever, or dodge. But I'll think about it. I'll be here till Thursday morning. If I have an answer in the next few days,
What, in your opinion, has the effect of Schindler's List had on the Jewish and non-Jewish communities in reducing or enhancing anti-Semitism?
That's a very good question. If you're talking about popular culture and the impact of popular culture, sort of Schindler's List in the museum, which I didn't discuss tonight, but which will be the outer boundaries of the work I'm undertaking now on the Holocaust as a symbol for America generally. I only spoke about American Jews tonight, but I want to address the question of America in general, serve as the outer boundaries. Let me tell you something. I don't know if it's so good to give you reason to question my own judgment, but I can't help but share this story with you. I'm my own worst enemy in that way sometimes. I went to see Schindler's List in a preview, as many people did. They were showing previews in different cities to sort of generate interest in it. And I went to see it in a preview about, I'd say, 3-4 weeks before it opened. And when I came back from the movie, it was late, but I nonetheless called friends who knew I was going and were anxious to hear what I thought. And I called them up, and they were both on the phone, and I said, I was very moved by it. It's very powerful. It has some shortcomings, but it's far more powerful than I ever thought it would be. I said, too bad nobody will go to see it. So they said, why is that? I said, well, it's in black and white and it's 4 hours long. What American is going to be interested in a black and white movie that's four hours long? So it shows you what I know, you know. Now, if you want to know what I think of the movie now, you know, I'll tell you how smart I am. I was, as you can well imagine, completely thunderstruck by the great interest in the movie and the impact it had when it came out. I think now, again, you know, people are less likely to sit 4 hours, probably 4.5 hours, and watch it on a video. But nonetheless, I think it brought the Holocaust into the consciousness of a lot of Americans who it hadn't been in their consciousness before. And whatever you think of Spielberg's choice of a story of a rescuer to tell the story of the Holocaust, some people were sort of distressed by that because it seemed to suggest, or they feared it would suggest to moviegoers that rescue was far more widespread than it really was. From Spielberg's perspective, from the perspective of making having people come and see the movie, it was a brilliant device. Because it made the story a palatable story. It sort of was a Holocaust story with quote-unquote a happy end. And if you're going to start where the client is at, you know, as people in the mental health profession say, it reached Americans. Americans want a happy ending. So even within this terrible story, there could be a happy kind of ending. In that sense. So I think a lot of people went to see it who might otherwise not have gone to see it. And also the fact that the main character was a non-Jew and it was the story of a non-Jew rescuing had a major impact.
Combine a couple of these. Can you give us kind of a profile, if there is one, of Holocaust deniers and suggest effective ways to deal with revisionists?
First of all, they're not revisionists, they're deniers. And I think we should excise that term because they're not revising anything, they're simply denying. To give you a very short and compact profile, deniers are first and foremost anti-Semites. And you might think it's bringing coals to Newcastle to stress that point, but when some of the students who have published ads or been in charge of newspapers that have published ads, the Holocaust deniers' ads, have been challenged by other students on campus as to why they did it. And one of the challenges raised by these other students is your own newspaper code, the code that the newspaper itself adopted is not to publish any ads which are demeaning of a minority group or sexist or racist, etc. And here you are publishing or anti-Semitic, publishing this ad. This happened not on one campus, but it happened on a number of campuses. The protesting students were told by the students at the newspapers, these ads are not anti-Semitic, they just deny the Holocaust. Now, that's more frightening than Holocaust denial itself, that a student, you know, editor of a newspaper cannot recognize that an ad denying the Holocaust is an anti-Semitic ad. But they are not just anti-Semites. Many of them, certainly not all, many of them are racists. And many of the leading extremist racist organizations, and maybe that's a redundancy to say extremist racist organizations, have adopted Holocaust denial as a mainstay of their identity for a number of reasons. First of all, they're not only racist, many of these groups, but they're also anti-Semitic. But the way they phrase it is, and the way the deniers play on it too, is that they will write things like, every time we want to write about or talk about the natural superiority of the white race, we're told that that's Nazi science, and Nazi science led to the Holocaust. So the deniers and or the racists will conclude the myth, quote unquote, of the Holocaust is used to keep us from talking about the natural superiority of white people. So they're also racist. But there's a third element. They have a political agenda. They have a political agenda, particularly in Europe, less so in the United States. That is to make National Socialism, Nazism, respectable again, politically acceptable again. Now, how do you make a thoroughly discredited movement politically acceptable? In one of two ways. Either you take the element which is used to discredit, the main element which is used to discredit it, and you justify it. And that's what the neo-Nazis tried to do in the first decades following the war, that the Holocaust really was a good thing. It was a good thing that Hitler did this, and the Nazis did this. It said the Germans did this, et cetera, et cetera. But that didn't work. That didn't win them many friends and influence many people. So what they figured out was a more efficacious way of operating was to say it didn't happen. And not only didn't it happen, they will go on and say, but who is spreading this myth about Germany? The victims, the supposed victims, the Jews. So they take it and turn it on and make it an attack on the Jews. So it has that political agenda. They are also, of course, have a conspiracy theory way of looking at the world. For the deniers to be right, the survivors all have to be wrong. But not the survivors, even with the importance of survivors, and you can tell from what I've spoken about, I don't have to belabor that point, the survivors are not really our best witnesses. On top of the survivors, or in addition to the survivors, first of all, we have the bystanders, the Poles, let's say, who were living in the villages right adjacent to the death camps, some of whom are interviewed in Lanzmann's Shoah, some of whom are interviewed and speak quite explicitly. The people who saw the trains going into the camp day after day, full and coming out empty. But they even are not our best witnesses. There are two better source of witness and documentation, or at least equally important, and that is, first of all, the reams of documents, reams and reams and reams of documents, which have been left to us by the Germans, by the National Socialist government of Germany, some of which in the National Archives, in archives in Germany, in archives in the former Soviet Union, in archives in many countries, in Europe, many European countries, and of course the perpetrators themselves. The perpetrators themselves, I'm not talking about Germany now generally, but the perpetrators themselves who said, I did it. You know, again, if you've seen Lanzmann's Shoah, you see a number of perpetrators that he interviews and who show the map of the camp and how people were forced to walk through. This is in Shoah, it's about the camp that's shown as Treblinka. But perpetrators who spoke not just as parts of trials, but afterwards in newspaper interviews and in other interviews, who talked about what they did. So, of course, for the deniers have this conspiracy theory that all these people are wrong and they're right. Let me just add one point here on denial. I sometimes cringe when, and on some degree I may take some responsibility, inadvertent responsibility, but when things like Holocaust courses or museums, and thank God not the museum in Washington has not done this, and I don't think ever will, use Holocaust denial as a means of sort of justifying study of the Holocaust, Holocaust courses. Holocaust courses and study of the Holocaust would be of equal importance if we have never heard of such an absurdity as Holocaust deniers. There is importance in and of itself on intellectual, scholarly, moral, ethical basis, etc. Number one. Number two, deniers are a very small group. I mentioned before Elvis Presley, 12%. There are more people who believe Elvis Presley is alive and well than believe that the Holocaust didn't happen. So you might say, then why all the fuss? Why all the attention? Why did you write this book on this topic? I wrote this book on this topic, and I'm concerned about it not for today, but for down the line, for in the future, because people such as the Holocaust deniers are tenacious in their efforts to stay in the public spotlight. What they're trying to do now, what their agenda is right now, is to make the Holocaust something open for debate and discussion, to convince you that there are two sides to the issue. Let's at least debate it. Let's at least discuss it. Further down, they'll move further with this agenda. I'm reminded, and just to share with you an anecdote, of two cousins of mine, a personal family anecdote, two cousins of mine who grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. And they are, my mother comes from a large family. They are the daughters of the oldest sister. My mother was one of the youngest. So there's quite a few years between us, about 15 or 17 years between us. Their father had a very small store and had just 1 or 2 employees, but one of the employees there intrigued my young cousins when they were quite small. His name was Charlie Washington. And they liked Charlie very much, and they were intrigued by him. First of all, he was quite old, and he walked bent over, and they'd never seen someone walk bent over, so this made an impression on their young minds. But more importantly, as they got a little older, Charlie would tell them stories about his childhood. Charlie had been born a slave on a plantation, and he taught them slave songs. And he took them to visit friends of his who had also had similar experiences. Charlie didn't remember slavery, but he remembered the civil period of the war itself, so had vague memories of slavery, and he certainly remembered the period afterwards. So for these 2 cousins who are 18 years older than I am, slavery is not something rooted in 19th century America. It's something that is very much part of their childhood memories. It's Charlie Washington's stories. It's Charlie Washington's memory. And no one is trying to deny slavery. Holocaust denial, when we no longer have survivors around to say, this is my story, this is what happened to me, I worry then what the deniers will do and what the deniers will say. So in essence, the idea is for people to be aware of this now and to understand it as a threat for the future, but never to turn study of the Holocaust, whether it be in courses, whether it be in books, whether it be in museums, whether it be in conferences like this, as a reason, as an answer to denial. That would be elevating the deniers far more than they deserve.
Before we adjourn for a book signing and further, more intimate conversations, and close this session, on behalf of the U of O and all of those gathered here watching elsewhere on television, please accept our most profound thanks for coming and sharing your work with us, Professor Lipstadt.
Thank you.
For the benefit of our live television audience, our next telecast will be the keynote address of Professor Richard Cohen tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Professor Cohen's topic will be What Good is the Holocaust? Until then, have a good evening, and thank you for joining us.